I have goosebumps all over. I couldn't sleep all night. We have been waiting for this moment for 14 years, and it's finally here. And we just can't believe that it's truly, this is our reality now.
One of colonialism's most enduring legacies is that for some of us, our struggles and sorrows and victories and losses are humanized in personal narratives. While for the rest of us, we're consigned to the dry prose of geopolitics. What does this mean for the price of oil? What will the Russians do? What does this mean for immigration in Europe? How will this affect US elections? For anyone following the news from Syria, it's quite clear that the collapse of the al-Assad regime in December 2024 falls into the geopolitics category, where the collapse of this regime after 70 years of draconian military rule and nearly a decade and a half of protests and civil wars is being analyzed more in what it means for everyone on the borders of Syria rather than those actually living there. So to push back against this narrative, I wanted to speak to someone who could talk about their homeland as a place that isn't just a strife-torn corner of the world, but as a cradle of human civilization, as a place that gave us agriculture, that gave us music, that gave us a profound sense of everything that we now believe to be human. Welcome to In Solidarity, the Open Democracy podcast about people, power, politics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Aman Sethi. Today, we're talking to Waseem Albahri. Waseem is a Syrian cultural heritage specialist with over a decade of experience in preserving heritage sites in conflict zones. Waseem, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aman. I'm very pleased to be here.
Waseem, we're recording this episode just before Christmas in 2024, about 2 weeks after the fall of the al-Assad regime in Syria. I noticed when I was kind of scrolling through your socials, because we do that sometimes, that you kind of talked about the fact that you never thought that this moment would happen.
Certainly.
Can you talk me through just briefly where you're at, how this felt, and how are you processing this current moment as someone who thinks about the past?
To be fully honest with you, we're still processing. There's just so much information, so many changes have happened in the last 2 weeks. This Assad regime came into the power about 50 years ago. So that's basically my parents' generation. And they came through al-Ba'ath party, which is calling for Arabism generally. And that's Assad, the father, Hafez al-Assad, and after this, Bashar al-Assad. This rule was authoritarian. It was seen as dictatorship. It suppressed freedom of speech, in many cases in very violent way. And I remember when I was in school, you couldn't even mention the name of the president, Hafez al-Assad, because you'll be afraid to be interpreted in a criticizing way, and then God knows what happens to you. Since around 14 years ago, as part of the wider Arab Spring that happened in many Arab countries, there were demonstrations that first started as peaceful, calling for social justice, for freedom, for reforms and all of that. And the response for that from the government was very violent, very harsh, and I would say one of the worst in comparison to other countries that experienced this Arab Spring. And years and years after that, this struggle became a war, an actual war. Some people refer to it as a civil war, others as proxy war. And year after year, at the first we were very hopeful that this change will happen soon. Assad will fall and we will have just a new future without this authoritarian dictator. But year after year, the conflict kept on going, and then there started to be a big displacement in Syria, big destruction, migration everywhere, refugee crisis that not only affected Syria, but neighboring countries, and also it reached many countries like Europe. And it started to raise these big questions about, migration and about what we should do and why we should take some people. So because of all of these disappointments, we could see some signs that the regime has become weaker, but we didn't expect it to fall that quickly. So that's why it became, I wouldn't say a surprise, but the surprise was how quick it fell. And it felt like as something you really wanted, that you thought that you're not going to experience in your generation. And suddenly it became a reality. And it opens up a lot of possibilities.
Right now, most Syrians are in a state of euphoria that there is an end to this brutal repression, corruption, exploitation. But what lies ahead is certainly very uncertain for many Syrians.
The new government plans to privatize large parts of the economy in a bid for the country to rejoin the international community.
It was easier to buy narcotics than books. The regime was particularly sensitive to books. They banned books that used to publish before the Assads came to power.
Now Radwan Sarakbi can republish treasures of Arabic literature.
That's really interesting that you say that, and especially this idea, well, two things. One, of course, your sense that one never thought that this regime would fall so quickly, but one could argue that this regime in many ways has been falling for 70 years, right? The kind of power that it takes to keep something going. And also, you're a heritage specialist, so you kind of work in deep time in that sense. And I think as we talk about the future of Syria, I think it might be interesting to first go into the past of Syria and kind of get a really sense of what is this land and where does this land come from. And as we go into this past, I'm reminded of two of my favorite sayings. So I have an Egyptian friend, and I, of course, grew up in India, which for a long time was kind of influenced by, you could say, a broader idea of Soviet soft power. And so my Egyptian friend and I, we often argue where we both have our favorite sayings about the past. And my favorite saying about the past is a Soviet proverb, which is that the future is certain, it is the past that is unpredictable. And my Egyptian friend's response to that is the famous William Faulkner line, which is, the past is never dead, it is not even the past, right? So holding these two tensions, like one of the things I think about when I think about Syria is that this is a land that has been continuously inhabited by a Homo sapien form for maybe 800,000 years. So on this podcast, in a brief bite, like, talk me through this past and talk me through how, in some ways, the tensions that have kind of held Syria together over these years are kind of shaped by this.
I agree with you about these sayings. To me, I see like heritage as not something only about the past. It's also about future. There is so much future in it, and I can explain that. And I think to explain what is like the past of Syria, maybe I can zoom out a little bit from the current situation, which is right now Syria is in a lot of chaos, has been a lot of chaos. It's been associated, if you Google Syria, with war, destruction, terrible crimes that happened, and all of that. And I think this is the image that exists in the mainstream media, and also sometimes in the memories of the Syrians themselves. But if we zoom out a little bit about this area, which is the Levant, which Syria is part of. The Levant is Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. This area has been like a gateway to Asia and Europe and Africa, from Africa. So a lot of civilization developed there, and also a lot of communities migrated from there. Syria has given to the world a lot of things, like it has given to the world the first musical notation, the first alphabet. It's believed that the first domestication of animals happened in this region, and also with Mesopotamia, the agricultural revolution that changed the world forever also happened in this region. And there's a lot of other inventions. But what I find the most interesting things is it has like one of the most continuously inhabited cities, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, like Damascus and Aleppo. And it says a lot of stories. Like if you look at one of the houses in the old city of Damascus and you try to dig deeper about the layers that are there, you can see like a lot of layers belong to many Islamic areas, but also before that, Byzantine, before that, Roman, Greek, also Aramaic, and a lot of things. And if you look into that, just one building can say a story about civilization rising to power and falling. In a way, like prosperity and destruction is part of the story. And what happened in the last few years may be more of a decline, but it's not the end, because this information is stored in stones, it stores in sometimes tales, in a lot of history books, in philosophy, in a lot of things. When you zoom out, you can see this is part of, it's not something unusual. The fall and rise of civilization and also states has been kind of one of the DNA of Syria. And it took part of many countries and many civilizations. At some point, Syria was part of the Roman Empire that stretched from the UK, actually, to Syria, to the North Africa. At other points of history, Damascus was the capital of the Umayyad Empire or Umayyad Caliphate. And there are so many states that, it's dynamic. So what I see is valuable now is looking and highlighting this point as part of the continuous history.
Tell me, and I think it's to kind of go deeper into this question. When you first wrote to us, you talked about the fact that for 70 years, the Assad regime in some ways weaponized this history, it weaponized this heritage. What do you mean by that when you said that? What was on your mind when you thought about the fact that this cultural history had been weaponized by the Assad regime?
What I meant by that is that the regime was very good in framing any success as part of their success, associating this with them. For example, if a football team wins, you will see immediately the propaganda of the regime, like taking pictures with the president or people in the high power. And that immediately takes it out from the people to the people in power. It takes it out to the state. And they kind of used the same thing about the heritage. They associated with the regime. They put when you go to these sites, you see the pictures of Assad, the father, and Bashar al-Assad. But at the same time, what the regime did is that they marginalized systematically a lot of heritage archaeological sites. Like in my home city of Sweda, which has a lot of Roman archaeology. It has a wealth of Roman archaeology. In the 90s, Assad the father built a highway on the top of a lot of theaters, all Byzantine churches, and many other things that are visible from the street. I mean, if you look down, you could see a Roman columns and all of that. And by this, of course, you're denying the potential of the sites for pride, for economic development, and also preventing tourism to come, which the regime was very good in doing. It undermined the role of heritage outside Syria, not to attract attention, because it didn't want to have that connection with the outside world. It was a way of keeping control, basically, by preventing this connection with the outside world. So for people, a lot of archaeological sites were seen as something belonged to the state, not to them. The underlying message, if you go close to them or if you interact with them, the police will come or they will, question you. So the ownership of this story was manipulated by the regime. And heritage, since it's a way of understanding who you are, if you take the story out, you dispower people. It becomes a story manipulated by the state and not by the people. And the fall of Assad, the way that I see it, there is a chance, an opportunity to tell new stories.
This is very interesting. I want to drill down more on this idea of heritage as a way of telling people who they are. Right, because in one sense, the Assad regime is not unique in doing this. The pharaohs who built the pyramids were saying something, right? There's something you say every time you build, you are saying, this is what power looks like. And every time you say, this is what power looks like, you're also saying who gets to be part of the story and who gets to not be part of the story, right? Is what I'm hearing from you, that by privileging certain kinds of heritage, you disempower other kinds of heritage, and then you tell a story about who belongs here now. And my country that I come from, India, and under the current regime, there is a systematic attempt to retell the story of India's Muslim heritage, for example. So famously, the kind of single biggest icon of driving the rise of the religious Hindu right in India was the destruction of a mosque in northern India in a town called Ayodhya, where the Hindu narrative went was the mosque was built on the birthplace of the site of Lord Ram, who the Hindus revere as a kind of foundational icon in the pantheon of the Hindu faith. So what and there's been a sense in India, of course, of the fact that immediately after independence, that the narrative which was told by what the current regime calls a secular elite deliberately marginalized Hindu heritage in an attempt to kind of tell a secular story, right? So their big project right now is to dismantle this secular story and say, no, actually the story is a totally different story. And the story you're telling is one of syncretic existence between Hinduism and Islam, and we're telling a different story. So what I'm interested in, however, is that the stories that people tell about, or the story that power tells about heritage, tells us something about power. So could you give me a kind of, like you referred to this in your previous example, but could you give me a specific example, for example, of a particular heritage site that the Assad regime was particularly invested in, and why they were invested in that specific site? Or an example of a particular site which they completely tried to airbrush out of history, and why they did that. Actually, if you would give me both, that would be awesome. But here's the space.
Sure. I think to answer maybe the first part of your question, which is how heritage can be part of power, if I understand correctly, because the way that I see it is one ways of getting and keeping power is having a propaganda. And propaganda is telling a story, a particular story. And this is where heritage, which is part of a wider culture, can be instrumental in that. It can strengthen this story that the people in power are trying to tell to keep their position. It's effective. And I totally understand what you mean in your story in India, because this is, of course, not unique to Assad government. It's been used, I think, maybe since the rise of civilizations, and even before that, the power of storytelling and then using memories and culture as way of strengthening this. When I think about an example, maybe I'll say something more personal that I remember. And it's not about a particular site. It's about something as a child I remember I was surprised to see. So when I was in primary school, there was a subject about history. And sometimes we had two versions of the same book, as a new editions. So I remember someone was reading a passage, and it was about amphitheater in the city of Busra. It's a Roman amphitheater in the city of Busra, which is a World Heritage Site. So the old version said that the Romans built this amphitheater. And then some students raised their hands. They were like, no, it says Arabs built it. So then the new version, they changed it. And actually you can see it, that it's kind of maybe in bold, putting the Arabs built it. And this is a way of, in that sense, a Baath party is telling the story that Arabs are great and they are the only people that anything related to heritage and anything great is related to Arabs. Of course, I'm Arab myself, and they have a great role, but it's not the full picture. There were many civilizations before Arabs. And right now, Syria has a lot of, they have Kurds, they have Syrians, and a lot of other people in some parts still speaking Aramaic, and a lot of also religious diversity. And what the regime at the time wanted to say, no, we're only one and we're only Arabs, and everything else we pretend it doesn't exist. And that was a way of manipulating this narrative and keeping it to serve its control. And I remember as a child, why they're doing that? Why, why there's Romans and then there's Arabs. This is one example that I can remember from childhood. And I see it, of course, it's relevant to other countries.
Hi, my name's Sian Norris, and I'm a senior investigative reporter at openDemocracy. My work investigating military sexual abuse, telling the stories of those at the sharp end of government anti-migrant policies, exploring prison data, and reporting on the dark money powering anti-abortion interests is only made possible thanks to your support. Please donate to support Open Democracy today. Simply visit opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you.
Waseem, you talked about this moment where as a child, you're like reading and you realize that between two different versions or editions of the same kind of school textbook, the people who built the amphitheater have moved from the Romans to the Arabs. This actually reminds me of this very interesting thing that we were always taught in India, which is that India had a great contribution to mathematics. There was the Roman numeral system, and then there is the modern numeral system, which I think around the world is called the Arabic system. But in India was taught to us as the Hindu Arabic system, which is a system of mathematics that the Indians and the Hindus specifically also had a role to play. I think the way that this story is told to us is it's told to us from the fact that the zero, the idea of zero or shunya, is something that, a certain form of Indian historiography lays claim to. And so the idea is, of course, that the Arabs and the people living in the Indian subcontinent were kind of constantly in touch. And so in India, everyone calls it the Hindu-Arabic system. Around the world, of course, everyone calls it the Arabic system. We see it as an act of erasure by the Arabs to erase our history in this. But what I find interesting is that if we were to look at this force that is in power today in Damascus, and who knows how long they're going to be in power for, right? They just got here. We have no idea how this is going to pan out. The world is still trying to figure out who they are. Are they hardcore conservative? Are they not? Are they this? Are they that? Like, this is an open question. I guess my question to you would be that as someone who has been kind of thinking about heritage and conservation and heritage architecture, what is the kind of story you would like to see emerge from here? And obviously it will not emerge today, it will not emerge tomorrow. Maybe it will begin with, a UN aid agency coming in and distributing some kind of basic kind of literacy textbooks. But if you were to write like the history textbook for a young child today, what is the story you would want to tell about Syria?
I think, in short, to be fully honest with you, I think it should have an open democracy. And what I mean by that is, like, I think one of the mistakes that the old regime did is that they highlighted the Arabism as the story to unite people in Syria, which by default marginalized others. And if the new regime, in my opinion, the new government would be smart, it will allow all the voices to be expressed and validated. And this is how I see democracy. It's not like to agree with another opinion, is at least allowing it to be expressed and validated, and you can disagree with it. But I think in order for this new government to be really legitimate and to have like both local and international legitimacy, I think it should take into consideration the mosaic of all of that. Of course, Arabic and the Arabic identity is very important in Syria. And again, I'm saying from an Arab perspective, but also there are other people there. And also there is this whole discussion now between a more conservative group of people, religious conservative, and more kind of liberal progressive group. And I think whoever be in power, there should be a way of allowing these two to exist in some way. Because if one of them is marginalized, the regime the new government will be by default fragile. And it's just a matter of time until a new revolution will happen. This is the way I see it.
One of the things I have been thinking about when I was kind of preparing for this podcast was thinking about the fact that there is a need today, I sense, across the world, whether it is, the eminent sort of moment where President Trump comes to power and says, one of the things that he wants to do is deport, I think, 20 million people in a matter of few days who he says have no right to be there. We're seeing tensions in France, we're seeing tensions in Germany, we're seeing a war in Ukraine about exactly who the Ukrainian people are. The Ukrainian people know who they are, but there is, of course, a former Soviet Russian empire in many ways that refuses to actually acknowledge that the Ukrainians have a right to self-determination. What would you say in some ways are things that we can learn from Syria, and not just from the 70 years of Assad's regime, but maybe the 70,000 years of inhabitation in Syria? What are the lessons we can take about thinking about who belongs to a land, or more importantly, who has the right to live somewhere? I mean, what I'm seeing is that the deep history of Syria and the deep history of the Middle East actually tells us that everyone has the right to be pretty much wherever they want to be. But tell me about how you're thinking about this.
Sure. Sometimes we get the tendency of believing that states and countries have been there forever, and this is the way things are. But if you think about borders, it's a very new thing. In most of humanity's history, there wasn't such a thing as borders. And migration is not something that is abnormal. It's the normal. For example, we as Homo sapiens, it's believed that we have migrated from Africa because of weather conditions, lack of food, lack of security. And we went through the Sahara to North Africa, through the Middle East to Europe, Asia, then to Americas and the whole world. So our story, one can argue, it's about migration. And it's very normal when things get difficult where you live is to go somewhere safer. And I challenge all these politicians, all these people in power that are anti-refugees, that are very nationalistic about we are better than the others. If they put themselves in the shoes of the others, if they face similar circumstances of these migrants, what they would do. I don't know if they have asked themselves this question. So I think a lot of problems that happen now is that we see ourselves as different from the other. And that's when this can pave the way to conflict or to division and all of that. And I think we are in many ways similar. And once we face certain circumstances, we will, react in a similar way. Culture is one of the ways of communicating, expressing thoughts and emotions, and evoking deeper emotions and intellectual thoughts. So if you try to express culture more, to try to talk about culture more, to make people connect through culture more, you by default making peace. And this is where I think one of the counter activities to some people that are anti-migration, like Trump and other people, is actually culture. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways.
One of the things that many years ago, I was involved in a dialogue on migration. And I had proposed that we need a new word for this. And I agree with you that this idea of borders is very new, because if you look back into history, people are constantly traveling, right? From one part of the world to another part of the world. There are trade routes, there are entire convoys, there are small communities that continue to exist in all the big major cities of the world. A sort of Chinese quarter and an Italian quarter and an Afghan quarter and an Indian quarter. And you see these small neighborhoods that sort of pop up. And again, Delhi, the city where I'm from, there are names for all of these neighborhoods that actually are hundreds of years old, because they essentially refer to landmarks on trade routes of the Silk Route. And so the proposal I had made was that we should retire the term migrant and in its place replace it with a sort of Indo-Persian Arabic word, musafir. Does that mean anything to you?
Yes, exactly. Musafir, traveler, guest. And we just see anyone who shows up as just that someone has come, that they need rest and they need space, and at some point they will probably go on, or they may choose to stay, and that's how the world should reorganize. And in some ways, I know this sounds probably completely unlikely, but one of the things I try to do is imagine utopias. Talking to you, I'm imagining if Damascus can actually, the next act of Damascus can be to become a truly global city, which says this is the oldest city in the world, and everyone from all over the world is welcome. And I think that would be kind of an incredible vision. I agree with you, even if it's like it looks utopian and all of that. But I think it's possible, because there's a potential not only to the people in Syria, but also to humanity, to people in all over the world, to understand ourselves as humans, because this tells a story of humans. Like we migrate, we live, we rise, we build civilizations, and these civilizations fall because this is a kind of something has been constant in history. All civilizations, all states, they have a time frame of prosperity and then they fall, but it's not the end. It's part of the story. And then they rise again. And of course, when we go to India, we see different maybe angle of our history. And if we like in the coexistence, so Damascus, Delhi, Paris, all of these cities, they tell a story of who we are. And they just from a different angle. So Damascus can, of course, has the potential to play a major role in understanding who we are, the story of humans, of civilization.
That is beautiful. I think that this seems like a great place to end this on this kind of hopeful note. Waseem, thank you for making so much time to talk us through this. It's been great having you on the show.
Thank you, Aman. It's been really enjoyable talking to you and having this conversation with you.
In Solidarity was edited and produced by Nandini Archer, James Battershill, and Ayodeji Rotinwa. Audio clips came from Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, The Wall Street Journal, France 24, and TRT World. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abela. Thanks for listening.